Mansal, welcome to the Meat Mafia podcast. This seems appropriate for what you do.
Yes, I have been called Meat Daddy, Meat, every nickname you can think of, including Meat. So
Meat Poppy?
not yet.
Not
If
yet.
you want to call me Meat Poppy, I'll take it.
That should be your new handle, honestly.
You've got the nickname Little Beaver. Is that right?
Yeah, it's not necessarily a nickname.
Okay.
I got adopted by the Crow Indians in Montana, and they use like animal names as a way of kind of identifying someone's medicine and things like that. So
Gotcha.
Yeah, that came from a hunt in the Bighorn Mountains.
What's the lineage of your name, Mansal?
It's actually Sanskrit, so other type of Indian. My mother's from India.
Okay.
And given how much I appreciate and learn from indigenous cultures, that often confuses people. But yeah, it's a Sanskrit word. It means strong.
Do you remember the way that I misspelled your name on the first calendar invite? I spelled it Mansal, Montsell, and I don't know where
you got that from.
I have no idea. He was just like, LOL.
It was worthy enough of me commenting. I don't know where this came from, but I appreciate the attempt.
It was almost so off you probably didn't even recognize it.
But I'm normally decent with spelling. I don't know what the hell happened there, but either way, man, we're so pumped to get connected. We've heard a lot about sacred hunting and the guided and private hunting experiences that you cultivate for a lot of men and the transformation that comes from that. I was telling you before, there's really only one other podcast we've ever done on hunting, which is with Robbie Kroger from Blood Origins. It was an amazing episode. And we have a decent amount of hunters that listen to the podcast. We have a lot of meat conscious, health conscious people that have never participated in a hunt before. So I think this is going to be a really unique and eye-opening episode for a lot of people. But I think to start off, man, I think we would love to just learn more about your backstory, what kind of got you into hunting. I think that would be a perfect place to start.
Yeah. So it starts, I think, like most people, with some type of wounding. And, there's Robert Bly is a famous male men's work oriented poet, and he has this quote. He says, like, in every wound is a womb, and it's like a birth of some type of gift. And for me, for sure, that was the case. So I grew up, I was really disconnected from and didn't really have any idea what it meant to be a man. And so for me, hunting was very much coming from a place of masculinity. Like, what is masculinity? How can I take responsibility? How can I embody a lot of the virtues that are associated with masculinity? And that ultimately was coming from such a wounded place as a boy, because I didn't have rites of passage that we would have had. I didn't have the guidance and the elders that I would have had in a indigenous culture, that I ended up seeking masculinity in the wrong ways and spent time in prison. So I got arrested. My house was raided when I was 19 years old. Ended up spending 6 months in the Texas State Penitentiary. And it was such a wake-up call of the way that I had been living, and just forced a lot of maturity and self-reflection. And I didn't know it at the time, but it really set me on a path to engage with a bunch of different practices, jiu-jitsu, whatever kinds of practices I could find that felt like they were allowing me to learn something about myself and masculinity. And hunting was, one of the final ones that I engaged with that just resonated so strongly that I kind of fell into, teaching it to others and talking about it and, philosophizing about it in some sense.
Had you hunted before you had gone to prison, or was it something you started afterwards?
No, this was something that I had started, I would say 3 years after I had gotten out of prison. And which is ironic because I am a third generation bow hunter. Both my father and my grandfather hunted. My father did not tell me anything about his hunting until I started. Wow. And that was because he had a lot of emotional and physical abuse from his father that was associated with hunting. So they would go out, he might mess up or something would happen, and he would just be berated for it. And so his memories were just so negative that he didn't even tell me. And it kind of took me going a completely different route to come to, a mutual shared interest.
Mansal, what was your mindset like actually getting out of prison as a 19-year-old?
So when I went to prison, I was actually 23. I went to jail first at 19, and then I had like a period where I had this anvil weight just hanging over my head, and then eventually I did go to prison. But I came out at 23, and honestly, I had already started a business. So I was trying to manage a business while I was in prison. It was e-commerce. It was in like nootropics and stuff like that. I founded a company called Pure Nootropics. And when I got out, there was a lot of gratitude. I mean, there's like everything just is completely different. And I remember raiding my parents' fridge and cupboards and was just like, wow, this food is so delicious. And there was a period of just kind of integrating back into society. And so there's, a lot of gratitude and things like that. But there was also uncomfortable situations where I didn't feel comfortable with people behind me. I didn't feel comfortable with people touching me from behind. Like someone would just come tap on my shoulder. And it's like, that's a huge no-no in prison. And I had to have, confrontations with people about that kind of thing in prison. So just reintegrating into society was a bit of a challenge. And when I look back on it though, prison is in many regards it's the closest to the jungle that humans really will experience anymore, because it's such a primal place. Like all the power, all the status, all the violence, all the everything you can imagine is in prison. And it's a different way of viewing, human nature.
Yeah. Part of why I was asking you that question is that I have a really close family friend that was kind of wrongfully accused of a crime and went to prison for about 10 months. And I think he got out, I think he was maybe like 26 or 27 years old. It was a few years ago. And when he got out, he wasn't bitter at the world, but he was incredibly motivated and focused, and ended up like getting a degree, getting a master's, now has an incredible job, has an amazing wife, and like really put his life together. And I think that he felt with prison, I think he just maybe felt like he was pissing his potential away up to that point and made some bad decisions that, even though he didn't technically commit the crime, put him in a situation where he did end up in jail. I just noticed this huge shift in him. So I'm just curious if you felt that similarly at a really young age.
For sure. I imagine that one of the reasons that I'm in the position that I'm in is because, I always say that prison was the best thing that ever happened to me.
Wow.
And I came out way more mature. I had a way better understanding of my own agency and sovereignty, because my prison experience was pretty clearly delineated. Like the first half was one way, the second half was completely a different way. And I came out and I spent a year very focused on like personal growth. That's kind of what I inadvertently was focusing on. I had kind of come to a certain high in my career at 23. And then I had to basically start over. And that really helped me to get into men's work at the time. Did something called Mankind Project and was in a men's group, and just really pursued a bunch of different practices that were going to help me to develop and kind of, without sounding cliche, like find who I am, or find myself in a sort of way. And it definitely lit a fire under my butt to be very focused on who I am and how I'm showing up. It was less external. It was less, I need to start a business, or I need to, do these outside things or create outside accolades. It was more a very, very strong focus on, I recognize I have flaws, and I have to be very, very conscious of where they are. And Jung has this great quote, your shadows can only take you down from behind. And so it was very much a process of just keeping them in front of me.
Got it. Was there a defining moment for you in prison where you acknowledged or realized some of these shifts that were happening internally for you?
Yeah, there was one moment in particular, I would say is probably the rock bottom moment of my life. I was in prison. Basically, I spoke with my lawyer. He said, hey, we have no idea when you're getting out. There was supposed to be a deadline, but that date had come and gone. And so before that date, I was really just resisting. I was counting down the days. I was trying to find any way that I could to kind of waste, kill time, numb the sensation of having my freedom taken away.
Mm-hmm.
Once that information came through, like, we don't really know when you're going to go. And the same day, my youngest sister spoke with me on the phone. She was pretty young, and my parents didn't tell her exactly what happened. So she really didn't understand what had happened, but she knew her brother had been taken away and didn't know where he was. And then I also found out that my grandfather was going to likely pass of cancer before I could actually get out. And went to my bunk, pulled my blanket over myself, and I definitely cried. And that was probably one of the hardest moments. And one of the bunkmates who's next to me, he just like said, head up, brother, head up. And the next morning I woke up and I had a completely new lease on life. And it wasn't necessarily positivity. It was just more surrender. Like, this is where I am, and this is my reality, and there's nothing I can do about it. And so I started reading everything I could get my hands on in the library, like every self-improvement book that was in there, which there was actually a lot I got to read. Started working out every single day. I luckily had a pretty good awareness around what physical, like calisthenics and stuff, could do. So they started calling me professor and doctor. I started helping them. At one point, I had a guy, ironically, his nickname was Cutthroat because he was in there for, murdering multiple people. And he's small. So I asked if I could squat him because I needed more body weight. Yeah. I didn't have any, I was just getting tired of body weight squats. And when, 200 guys in the cell see me squatting a guy named Cutthroat, then it just gets a certain level of respect. So then they started to like really respect me and come to me for advice and stuff. And so that second half was a completely different experience. But I realized, in the laboratory of my life, here I was in the exact same position. It was controlled environment. There was no difference between the first 3 months and the second 3 months, but the second 3 months I had a completely different perspective and relationship to where I was. And that showed me, I can be anywhere and in any circumstance, and my mind controls my environment.
In those second 3 months, did you almost like not forget about the outside world, but just become so integrated that you just like created this new reality for yourself?
Yeah, it was, I wouldn't say I forgot necessarily, but I just followed at a distance. I knew that my job was every single moment, how can I be the best version of myself where I was? And luckily I didn't have the experience that I was wrongfully accused. I 100% committed the crime.
Yeah.
And so, I just accepted it and accepted that was part of my penance.
Mm-hmm. Is your family amazed by the transformation that you've made over the last decade?
I don't know if amazed is the right word. I would say they both can see very much the changes that have occurred, and they both, in many ways, allow me to be somewhat of a leader in the family. Both my parents come to me for advice in certain regards. And as far as the unity of the families oftentimes become a lot closer when they have to go through challenges like that. And my whole family definitely rallied around me. And so we are very close. And a lot of that is my leadership. And that's because I value it. But, there's just something about really challenging situations. It's like a diamond. A diamond Definitely. Is created under pressure, and I had that pressure, and that was in a way a luxury for the family because I get to bring that wisdom back, and they don't have to go through that experience.
Definitely. And so you'd mentioned you're technically a third generation hunter. Your dad was big into it. He didn't talk about it. So how did you actually get into hunting yourself?
Well, funnily enough, I because I was in the nootropics world and had created some companies there, I knew like some biohackers, Ben Greenfield in particular. So I reached out to Ben. I said, "Hey, I've noticed you've hunted before. Do you have anyone you could introduce me to that could allow me to learn?" And he introduced me to somebody who eventually became a mentor in hunting for the first few years. And that's how I started. But, I had a very interesting route compared to others because I was a felon. I'm technically not allowed to use guns at all or own them. So I had to go to archery right away. And so my early experiences, all of my experiences have been bow hunting, which is a different skill level. It's a different intimacy with the killing of an animal. And so it was, in some ways kind of an interesting silver lining to going to prison.
Got it. So bow hunting was more almost like out of necessity versus like preference over a rifle.
Yeah, for sure.
Cool.
And it's romantic for a lot of people to start with archery, but it's definitely more ethical to start with a gun. So it was, not something, I got lucky that I was able to be successful early on.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
It seems like hunting is making a comeback right now too, with like Joe Rogan and Cam Hanes kind of like popularizing the archery component of it at least. And to your point, it does seem like there is like this romanticization of just like pulling the bow back and firing it. But you made the point of saying like guns is a more ethical way of doing it. Why is that the case?
Yeah. First time hunters are inexperienced in every way imaginable, pretty much, unless they're ex-military or something. And so when you go to a range and you're firing a rifle and you're taking a bunch of shots, it's a completely different experience than if you go into the field and you're in some awkward position on one knee, on a hill, the animal's moving, it gives you 2 seconds, your heart is beating out of its chest. So it's just a completely different ball game when you have an animal whose life and death is literally in your hands. And that makes people perform less effectively in many instances. Mm-hmm. And so if you bring that dynamic immediately to archery, which is even harder, it's doable and people can definitely practice and make it happen. I just don't recommend it for beginners because it puts unnecessary risk on the animal. And ultimately, it's not all about us. We're engaging in, as much as possible, the most ethical pursuit. And so taking that romanticized view and kind of recognizing it has a place, but it doesn't necessarily need to be the first step, I think is important.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So more ethical, because in the beginning, the rifle will probably allow for like a cleaner, quicker death for the animal. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. What was the feeling like actually taking an animal's life for the first time?
It was a combination of a lot of things, which I think is probably common amongst those who allow themselves to feel that with hunting. It's for those who are like empathetic and really feel deeply around certain things, which I find myself to be a pretty sensitive man, mm-hmm. It is quite a tension of feelings. So on the one hand, I pretty much couldn't get a smile off my face when I shot the first shot because it was, we later found out it was straight through the heart of the animal, the first shot that I ever took, which is exactly what I had asked for when I was in an ayahuasca experience 1 month prior. And so it felt like divine in certain ways. But at the same time, I waited and I noticed that this herd of antelope that was, essentially all family, it was all female family together. They came into my field of view laughing they were playing with each other. Mm-hmm. And they all went over, sniffed and looked at and touched the animal that I killed. And when they walked away, all of their heads were down. And it was very clear. And I can even feel it now, feeling like emotional about it. It stood out to me mm-hmm. that I don't necessarily understand the way that they feel, but they feel.
Mm.
And that is and that brought, a certain sadness as well.
Yeah.
What type of animal was it?
It was a black buck antelope. Yeah.
Dang. So when I was doing research for the podcast, basically every single one had rite of passage kind of in the show notes or like in the podcast. And that was a topic that everyone talked about. And I was like, why is hunting just considered this rite of passage moment for men in particular? Because it does obviously seem like the closest point to life and death, but we've gotten into this modern sterilized world, and now people are kind of like we've like lost this rite of passage or this moment where you kind of like become a man. I'm just curious your perspective on all that. Like what makes hunting that rite of passage?
Yeah, there's so many cultures and so many different types of rites of passage, and obviously not all of them are hunting. Some of them are very challenging, situations. A lot of times, entheogen psychedelics are involved, or altered states of consciousness are involved. But I think hunting is so universal because there are literally people and tribes who do not allow a male to have a family, to, marry a woman or whatever the case might be, until they can adequately hunt, because in those tribes, that's how you provide. And so it's very closely aligned with, like, skill in hunting is very closely aligned with the next step in life. And today we can, quote unquote, provide by putting numbers in a bank account and, using that to purchase things. But that's really just been a very short period of time in human history. Way back when, for most of human history, it's been a necessity. If you cannot pull your weight, then you cannot actually have a family.
Yeah. Did you ever see Shia LaBeouf's podcast appearance on John Bernthal's show? I think there's a clip, there's like a really powerful clip where he's talking about, like, he's like literally asking the question, like, in modern society, what does it actually mean to be a man? Like, is it when you graduate high school? Do you graduate college? Are you 18? Are you 21? Like, there's no tests anymore. It's kind of like you go to school and they just kind of spit you out and you're like, you're a man now. Where it seems like back in the day, to what you're talking about, there were these like challenging tests that ultimately determined, okay, you're now ready to make these next progressions in your life. And it seems like for you, hunting was really that like rite of passage, which is why you talk about it so often publicly.
Yeah, definitely. And I think another part of it that probably goes underappreciated is the mentorship part, because in any kind of tribe, they might have had this rite of passage, this really big challenge or this hunting experience, but they always had elders, whether it's uncles or grandfathers or just wise people that are in the tribe, to help them integrate those learnings. Mm-hmm. And they had basically not just one person, which, in modern day, it's like our father or whatever our singular father figure is in the nuclear family that we have, the model that we have, but they would have had tons of examples. And that's really important, because my experience wouldn't have been the experience that it was if I didn't have a mentor. I worked with someone, Will Starhart. He was, someone who led sweat lodges out in Wimberley, about 45 minutes from here. And we worked together for 8 years, and he was absolutely incredible, wise person. And he helped me put my experiences into context and allowed me to see the experience for what it was in my life. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where a lot of the gold is, because there are millions of people who go out and hunt every year. There's plenty of Americans, there's a hunting culture, et cetera. And, without necessarily sounding judgmental, there are plenty of adults who are still boys. And so it has a lot to do with how these experiences provide reflections to people in order to allow them to grow into, their next stage of evolution.
Yeah. I imagine that's part of the reason why your company is called Sacred Hunting, where there's like a deeper level than just actually, going out and hunting like we kind of think of it today. or a lot of people in modern culture think of it.
Totally, yeah. And just as a logistical note, but it points towards a more specific way that I relate to this kind of work. So the sacred hunting is technically a federally recognized church. So the government has recognized that we utilize psilocybin as a sacrament for spiritual purposes and divination purposes and things like that. And that very much, paints how I view it as well. It is more of a spiritual place for people to go to connect with their form of higher power. I don't pretend like a lot of organized religions, like I have the key, but I do think that hunting is, for men especially, kind of a route to both self-development and self-growth, but also spiritual connection to things greater than ourselves.
It's really interesting to hear your perspective on elders and mentors, because it's so intuitive. Like, the elders, obviously, they have the most experience, therefore they have the most wisdom, the most tips and things like that to pass on. And it makes you appreciate like how backwards we've come as a society, where we literally put our elders into nursing homes versus like actually learning from them and absorbing their knowledge.
Yeah. I think in some regards, it kind of comes down to our relationship with death, which is fear. There's a lot of fear associated with it. And that keeps people who are near death at arm's distance.
Yeah. How has hunting changed your relationship with death?
It's made me a lot more comfortable with it. One thing that I am surprised by after many years doing this kind of work is there's a part of me that, we're reciprocal beings. So I have gained so much from nature. Every time I have an animal that I kill, that I eat, I count it. I remember the experiences of taking their life, the intensity that entails. I mean, you can just imagine how many lives have gone into your survival to the years that you've been alive, right? And because I have a pretty intimate relationship with those lives, there's a part of me that very much can't wait and is excited to give my body back to nature and to be able to fulfill my end of the bargain in coming full circle. And I've told people, I just put me on a tree, next to on my land somewhere, and allow the scavengers to come like take my body back. And it's no surprise that a lot of indigenous people actually did that. They're called sky burials. But yeah, so that's one part. One part is this kind of surprising desire for it in a way. And it's also heavy. And it also is, I count every single animal that dies in sacred hunting experiences. We've come to 144 at this point. And that the weight of those animals and some of the experiences of young ones or injured ones, or there's just a lot in there that reminds me of the sadness and the discomfort, not necessarily discomfort because of fear, but discomfort around not dying the way that I desire, wanting to control a certain situation or whatever. And so, it's both, light and dark that I've experienced.
What are some of the common revelations that you've seen other people have on hunts when you bring them out and show them for the first time what it's like to actually take a life?
Yeah, I've been really surprised to the last point. I call it death medicine. Just being intimate with death creates its own type of medicine. And so there's one story from earlier this year in March. A friend of mine, he had a daughter that was born and then died immediately. So her name was Sage, and we were on the hunt together, and we kind of found this animal that we thought had died, but it was really just immobile, didn't move anywhere. And we went up to it, and basically I told him, like, we need to kill her to take her out of her misery. And we killed her. And when we like did further examination. Basically, she had a child that had died inside of her, and she had an infection, and she was going to die. And he just had such a deep release because for him, it just brought up his daughter that had died.
Wow.
And so just the proximity and the intensity of such a situation, if the men allow themselves to feel it, can bring up all different types of things. And, that's just one example. I've had people who cried thinking about a friend who committed suicide or lost a loved one. It just opens up a door for them to relate to death on the whole. And there's that's one piece of medicine that comes from the hunt, but there's also a lot of men who tap into something, in a more positive way that they didn't know existed, that feels really, really good. And they don't necessarily have to feel judged by it or judged for it. And so, we live in a world where masculinity, the term toxic masculinity, gets thrown around a lot. And of course, there is a shadow side to masculine expression, but also the way that it's being treated commonly today can sometimes make it so that men don't feel like they have an outlet at all to express themselves. And we all have violence that we're capable of. We all have a killer in us. Our ancestors only got us to the place where we are alive because they killed a lot, not just other animals, but humans. And if we just pretend that because we live in cities and we're not supposed to be that way, that we're going to somehow transcend that, that's not true. It's a fallacy. And so for a lot of people, and myself included, it is really healing to just integrate that. There's a way to bring violence and killing that's also in service.
When did you first start to integrate the plant medicine component into these sacred hunting experiences?
It was virtually immediately, because my experience was so heavily colored by both of those. So, there's three experiences that really shaped my view of it. And first, about a month before I went to my first hunting experience, I had a men's only ayahuasca experience. And in that experience, it was a really profound, first ayahuasca experience. I'll spare you all the details, but it was the first time I actually felt a relationship to higher power, because I grew up with no religious background. I was kind of a blank slate, which I feel really grateful for. And so my first experience with God or higher power was feeling the presence of it. And you can, however one wants to interpret that, it was a psychedelic for sure. There's, neurological things happening, but I felt that presence. And in that moment, I asked God, just allow this animal to have a quick, clean kill. That's all that I want. First time I had prayed to God in my life. So when I had that shot that killed the animal through the heart, and everybody told me that's very statistically improbable for a first-time archery hunter, it started the wheels turning for me that there was something here. And I kind of went down this rabbit hole of connecting with death and reading a bunch of books. And then I did ayahuasca again and had a lot of revelations around the meat that I ate. And so I just made a commitment that I was going to only eat meat that I killed myself for that year. And I stayed with that commitment. And so the experiences that just accidentally happened around each other were so potent for me, both the plant medicine and the hunting, that I saw their value together, even if I couldn't articulate necessarily why at the beginning. Though now, after many years of doing this, I have a very good understanding of why it is.
Is there any historical context to that too? Like, is there tribes or other groups of people that used to hunt using similar medicine?
So virtually every single culture uses some type of altered states of consciousness in order to hunt. And in South America, they often call it hunting medicine. Ayahuasca is used very commonly in order to connect with the spirit of the animals that they're hunting, in order to connect with the jaguar and their like hunting prowess. Another two substances in the jungle, something called hape, which is like a tobacco snuff that is used very commonly for hunting, and also kambo, which is like a toxin frog secretion that's used as kind of a mind-altering substance that is also used for the purposes of hunting. So there's a huge historical context for psychedelics being used alongside hunting. And in fact, there's even, oddly enough, there's a study they did recently where there's a tribe in Peru, that the Shipibo, that uses certain hallucinogenic plants with their dogs in order to more effectively hunt even today. And the study found that the dogs were more successful utilizing these substances. And I think, they're mammals and we're mammals. I think there's a reason why.
Yeah. Do you find that most men that participate in the hunts, do they also participate in the plant medicine component? And my second question is for most men, is it their first experience with plant medicine in general on this hunting experience?
So most people do go through both. There have been a few who, just decided for whatever reason that they didn't want to, but I would say like 95% or so decide that they want to have both the experiences, mostly because so much of a psychedelic experience is the set and the setting, and making sure that it feels like a safe place to go through that experience. And I very much have a very good set and setting that allows people to feel safe. And I would say 15% to maybe 20% have never had psychedelics before. And so this is their first introduction, which is not a responsibility I take lightly. And, but yeah, that's about the breakdown. And what I found is, although there is a historic context, and although that is beautiful to tap into in certain ways, especially the acuity and just the feeling of sensory, like increased sensory perception of surroundings. The main reason that psychedelics are so valuable in this context is because most people, and men in particular, are not given the tools for understanding their own feelings and emotions and allowing themselves to feel fully. And one thing that psychedelics do really well is create an environment where you almost have to feel things and experience your emotions. And that is very much what I seek to bring into these experiences, because feelings and emotions are the fertile soil and the seeds for transformation to occur. And so for someone who just kills an animal and is kind of numb to the whole process, which is many, and it's in some ways, it can be effective and even valuable in certain specific circumstances. But because we don't have a really great access to our emotions and feelings, I create both the space for and utilize the psychedelics to allow people to like really dive in there. And that's where a lot of the transformation occurs.
Yeah. The amount of responsibility that you have facilitating these experiences, it's really hitting me now. It's incredible, whether it's like facilitating someone's first hunting experience, plant medicine experience, or just the general traumas, like you had mentioned, that people are dealing with while they're on these experiences with you. I'm sure that's like a very humbling feeling for you as well. It's a lot of responsibility too.
Yeah, it's been, one of the greatest ways for myself to learn and grow as a leader, because it is a big responsibility. And I have to, in order to be at that level, I have to step up. I have to be, constantly learning and growing myself, and also just being able to hold that. And so, yeah, I have a lot of gratitude for, especially the people early on. Most of them were friends who trusted me and allowed me to learn. And I had a lot of great teachers as well. Will, he passed away last year, but he was 82 when he passed. And so I learned so much about what it takes to hold space for somebody going through something that's really challenging. And that was, really helpful. And also I've gone through such shit myself that if I can plumb my own depths, I taught a facilitator training in February where basically I brought, 13 former attendees who wanted to learn and start to step into more leadership. So now I have, people who are leading events in Colorado, in the Pacific Northwest and things. And a key thing that I emphasize is you can only facilitate to the level of your own healing. And so, I've been very blessed that people, trust me in that regard. And I don't take that lightly either.
What's your philosophy on healing and just being complete? Like, when does the healing stop, I guess?
I think you bring up a good question, because on the one hand, I think it's easy to say, and I think there's a certain amount of validity in saying that the healing never stops, because there are things that occur regularly that either reignite a wound, or you go through a relationship later in life and you create new wounds, or whatever the case is. And at the same time, I think there's a really important perspective to have that is not ingraining this belief that I'm constantly wounded.
Right.
And so, a lot of what the work is that I'm doing is, there is healing of people's individual traumas, whatever those might be. But there's also healing kind of a collective trauma, if you will, because we've all been, just like you guys talk a lot about the way that we eat, right? And we know that we've consumed food in a very specific way for many thousands of years, and it's only recently that we've started to deviate from that. The same is true for community. The same is true for connection. The same is true for relationships and all in connection to nature and the way in which we felt, a place that we could identify with. And so I think we all have some underlying level of longing for a way that used to be. And what I create in these experiences can oftentimes just be healing for them to experience, even for a micro moment. I take everybody's phones during the experience. So we are hunting altered states of consciousness with a group of brothers in nature. It is, maybe just a moment of feeling like, whoa, this is what it means to be a human, even in a small way. And that in and of itself is healing. So I'm mindful not to make this all about healing per se, but also creating, because a lot of amazing creation comes from understanding this cycle and being connected to it. And I see people, create their own companies, and I've had people, quit jobs and start new ones and things like that. And that's not necessarily healing. It's just coming into a place of creation and kind of becoming what I say is, it's not necessarily self-improvement as much as it is like self-unfoldment. So they're unfolding through their life.
Yeah, it's that beautiful metaphor of the fertile topsoil that you were talking about.
So beef tallow has obviously re-exploded in popularity the last couple of years. I've got a good story for you.
I like where this is going.
I somehow found this Russian website that sells bear fat by the jar. It was the first time I ever heard of bear fat before.
Didn't even know.
And I was like, I need to order 17 jars of this stuff because it sounds incredible. I didn't even know that bear fat was a thing. And then doing research for you today, I saw this amazing YouTube video where you basically teach people how to properly render bear fat. And one of the things that you had taught me is that in the 1800s, it was like this prized commodity of the frontier. So if you'd be comfortable just like sharing a little bit about the history of bear fat that you've come across and just how good of a cooking fat it actually is and how nutrient dense it is, I think that'd be pretty cool for the listener.
Yeah. So black bear was by far the #1 most desired edible animal that was in North America. And when people would hunt for deer, they were actually hunting for the skins. So if you've heard the term like $20, $100, that is referencing buck skin, because that was a unit of measure of trade.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the early Scottish, Irish settlers that had come through the Cumberland Gap, through Appalachia, they kind of really, made their way into that open, like Ohio River Valley and stuff. They would hunt for black bear, and there's stories of like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone who would literally kill like dozens of black bear a year. And so they would eat that. And bear grease is what the term was for bear fat, but they would render it and then they would use it for basically everything. Because you got to understand that at that time in the 1700s, late 1700s, in the 1800s, there weren't a lot of cows and there weren't a lot of, pigs necessarily. And so acquiring fat was actually a lot harder and more challenging than it is today. And black bear was one of the most readily available sources of fat. And so they would take that fat, they would use that lard, and it is so black bear and hogs, pigs, share a common ancestor. That's why a boar is used to describe, the term boar is used to describe a male pig and a male black bear and grizzly bear, and sow is for the females.
Interesting.
So because of that shared ancestor, it is considered lard. So bear fat is considered lard. It was used for trading. They would use it for soap. They would use it for salves, like balms and stuff. They would use it for cooking as well. It's known to be like the best, absolute best fat for cooking baked goods. It's a shame I don't really do much baking, but
make the best pies with bear
pies.
Yeah.
And I do have a friend who's a baker, and he leads sweat lodges, and he'll make like empanadas and stuff, and I'll just throw my gluten-free sensibilities out the window in order to eat that. So it's really good for baking. I use it a lot for mixing it with venison because it's like adds fat to a more lean animal. But yeah, last year I hunted for black bear, and me and a friend up in Ontario, Canada, we killed 2 bear, and we ended up rendering 10 gallons of bear fat, which I still have a ton of.
You're the fat king too now, apparently. Yeah.
How long will that last you? 10 gallons.
I mean, it's been a year as of tomorrow. And so I think it'll probably last me at least 1.5 to 2 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
I wonder what the amount of saturated fat is in like a serving of bear fat versus beef tallow. That'd be interesting to find out.
Yeah. So it depends a lot on what they've been eating and what time of the year it is. And just given how the temperature of things, or when it's solid versus when it is a liquid, I would say it's less saturated fat than like a beef tallow. But I killed it myself. I know where it came from. I did it myself. I'm not complaining.
Yeah, this is probably a stupid question, but when you're killing a black bear, you're using a rifle?
I used a bow.
Wow.
Yeah.
Can't miss. Before we hit record, you said that you were like 10 yards away?
Yeah, I was about 10 to 12 yards away, and we were in Ontario, and the bear came in. One thing, if you're hunting black bear, you'll hear noise all over the place. It's always the squirrels and chipmunks. But a black bear does not make a sound. Because he's a predator, he comes in very silently. And so he walks in, and I'm sitting still. He kind of can sense something's not right with my general area. So he's looking over at me. My heart, I don't think it's ever pounded that hard before. I had a knife that was basically on my lap, and I pulled back the bow and took the shot on him. And if he had charged, it was basically just like me and my knife versus him. But luckily he went different direction. And we ended up, tracking him a couple hours later and finding him. But it was definitely a pretty intense experience.
How long does it take to like get him out of the woods and like do that whole process?
Yeah, so a black bear, there's two ways that that you've killed a black bear, generally speaking. One is they will make a like death moan, which I did not hear, but from most people, what they say is that it's so like blood curdling because it sounds like a human. It'll move you, physically, because they're a very intelligent, extremely human-like animal. And the other is to hear thrashing. And so I didn't hear either of those. So I was very worried that I might have injured it, but not killed it. And so you wait a couple of hours. You don't want to go track it immediately because you can find it when it's wounded and then it will attack. And so we waited a couple hours. We started tracking. We found some blood. We saw that there's blood on both sides of the trail where it ran down, which is a good sign because, it's a higher amount of blood. We keep following and we're unsure at this point exactly, what it hit, whether it's going to actually die. It starts to run uphill and we see that the blood is even more intense. Mm-hmm. And so at that point we knew it probably hit an artery. And so we got up to the top of the hill and it had basically ran up the hill, gotten woozy, and just fell down the hill and died. And it was far enough away that I couldn't hear it. And so when we found it, that was one of the most incredible feelings to not have injured it and to have, I still have meat. It fed me for a year, and as soon as I thought it was all over and everything was good, they said, okay, we're going to go get the sled. The guides that I was with, they weren't with me when I shot it, but they were with me to help track it. They said, we're going to go get the sled. You stay here, put another arrow on because bigger black bear will come try and steal this black bear to eat. And I was like, wow, that's savage. Okay. So I'm just sitting there by myself, looking around, knowing that basically I'm guarding my kill, which is now bait for some other bigger bear. But they came back in an hour or two, and we basically had to haul the bear out. And dude, that bear is 250 pounds, and I can move 250 pounds easy on a barbell. I could not budge that thing on the ground. Dead weight is so different.
So different.
And so we ended up getting it in the sled, and then we basically had to like sled it home. We're getting hit with branches and I was getting impaled with branches and stuff, but we got it out.
Dang.
That, the effort probably just makes it that much more enjoyable, but that 1 to 2 hours waiting must have been so intimidating.
Yeah. There's so many times when it was very intimidating, but it's just looking around constantly. Like it's a different ball game. The effort makes the experience so rewarding. And I had a guy who came a couple of years ago. He's Israeli. He was in the military. And when he killed an animal, I always encourage men to carry it back. And we can field dress it. All the guides, no matter where we are, the guides look at me like I'm absolutely crazy. Like, why wouldn't you just bring the truck up here and get the animal and take it back? But when the men carry the animal and they carry the metaphoric responsibility of ending a life and bringing that back, they are exhausted, but they never forget that experience. Mm-hmm. And, that guy, Alon, he said, for the first time ever in my life, I feel like a man after he brought that animal back. And so it's a very powerful experience to be challenged.
It's hard to fathom anyone ever wasting an ounce of that meat after being part of that experience and knowing what the animal gave to nourish you.
Exactly. And that's one of the main, reasons why it's so important to me. And, I'm not perfect. There are times where I'm just doing my day-to-day work and I kind of forget what I'm eating is so special, or I forget the moment, but I will never waste that food. And and suffice it to say, if there's ever anything that doesn't taste good to me or like it's gone bad or whatever the case is, my cats are spoiled.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
What types of changes do you see people make after they go on a hunt like this for the first time, I imagine you've seen some amazing transformations within the experience itself, like the first parts of people's lives starting to shift from this new perspective they have. But afterwards, what do you see them go do?
Yeah, it ranges in a lot of ways. I mean, many continue to hunt. So they had their first experience with me, and then they go back home and they hunt, and they have, lifelong friends that they met at the experience that they hunt with. So, I might 2 years down the line, I might not know it until one of them mentions, hey, we've been getting together and hunting every year since, we saw you.
That's amazing.
And so those kinds of, relationships are really powerful. I've had people who end up leaving their relationship soon after because they realize it's just not, nurturing them in the way that they like. Definitely people who have left their professional career, taken a different path with their work. A lot of people want to pursue this further in both a participant capacity, but also a leadership capacity, because, so many men want a place where they can experience, connection to some type of spirituality. And I just consider spirituality like something higher than oneself or outside of greater than oneself. And, for years, I think most people saw women experience that through yoga in a lot of cases. And my judgment is that there's a lot of scenarios where women can experience spirituality, and men have more limiting numbers of spaces for that. And so it seems like a lot of men especially, just really gravitate towards like, this is my spiritual practice.
Mansal, are there any big hunts or experiences that are still on your bucket list that you want to check off in the coming years?
At this point in my life, I have, I wouldn't say graduated, but my interests have been around like tracking big predators. So cats in particular. Last year I went to Russia and I tracked Siberian tigers in Russia. I went to Peru and tracked jaguars. And so just tracking these and like seeing these absolutely epic specimens are spiritual in their own right. There's plant medicine, and this is like a type of animal medicine. So a lot of like cat tracking events are kind of on my personal radar. I don't hunt them. I just have too much of a connection with cats to kill them, but tracking them is something that I find interesting. And then I would say also there's a lot of opportunities to hunt with tribal people. That would be exciting to me. I mentioned I hunted with the Crow Indians in the Bighorn Mountains, and I've hunted with, Navajo, and so going to South America, hunting with some of those tribes, either Shipibo or Yawanawa or something, I think would be pretty special.
You mentioned jiu-jitsu earlier on the show, obviously hunting, but then also plant medicine. And I feel like Joe Rogan's done a pretty good job of popularizing all three of those, but I also feel like going a layer deeper, there's more of a common thread than just like Joe Rogan talking about it. I'm curious to get your take on that. Like, what seems to be the commonality there that brings those three things together?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm curious if it's the actual practices itself, or if it's the type of people and the consciousness that they're bringing to those practices. Because there's a really good book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And, from the title alone, you can see he's taking something that ordinarily could be mundane, which is just, maintaining a motorcycle, and seeing the spiritual transformational opportunities therein. And the way you do one thing is the way you do everything. And so I think there's there's a person who is drawn to find the depths of themselves and the depths of what it means to be human, the depths of what it means to be in this human experience. And oftentimes that will gravitate towards, some of these maybe more extreme types of experiences or activities. Hunting definitely is one of them. doesn't make a lot of logical or rational sense to go hunting. Meat is so much cheaper and more readily available in the store. And so it takes somebody who's willing to acknowledge that I'm doing this because I want to go deeper. And the same is true of jujitsu. I think, we, barring pretty rare circumstances, we live in a pretty safe place. So it's not like you need this in order to be safe. It's, I want to go a layer deeper and see what I'm made of and see the skills that I can grow. So I think it probably has more to do with the consciousness of the individual than necessarily the practices, but they definitely have a huge overlap.
Yeah,
They do.
For sure.
I forget, was it Tim Ferriss? Someone was raving about Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Making. It was someone really well known.
Yeah.
Because I definitely have heard of that book before. So that book's had a big impact on you?
No, not at all. I haven't read the book.
Yeah.
But the title,
But just the
reference to me is so imperative because, I see there's so many things that that's how I oftentimes view my life. And, I write a newsletter every week and people are like, wow, it's so, it's so great. And like, it must take you so much time. And I'm like, no, I write this newsletter because it allows me to refine the ways in which the mundane things that happen week to week actually are reflections of something deeper in my own life. And that's everything, everything we do gives us an opportunity or reflection.
Yeah. And so that's interesting because you were saying that you've had a very successful CPG career. So like a newsletter to a typical CPG founder is like, oh, there's like a revenue generation opportunity. But for you, it's more of like a reflection opportunity. That's really why you're doing it, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of intrinsic motivation that comes from creating that newsletter. And there's also a certain amount of intangibles in the work that I do that I don't know how to calculate and don't care to necessarily calculate. But, when someone who has a company that's sold to BlackRock that processes $20 billion and wants to have me come just work with him and his two sons when he says like, I followed everything in your book and your newsletter, I just would love to have you out. I don't no idea of how to quantify, the one person who is just so resonant with what I'm sharing versus the spreadsheet that says people buy this or that or whatever the case is. So
I feel like the newsletter example is like a nice anecdote of like the inward work that you did in prison and kind of just almost not doing the stuff for, you're not writing the newsletter for other people. You're really like doing it for yourself. And then positive things happen in your life because you're doing that and sharing it with other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there's probably a lesson for generally how one walks through life about like intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. And I'm not perfect and it's taken a lot of work, but there are very few things that I do for other people in my life or for their perception of me.
Right.
Yeah. I love that example that you used of the like the entrepreneur that had sold the company to BlackRock with the two sons that had followed everything that you've done, had read all your newsletters and the opportunities that's brought your way. Because similar to Harry and I, we did this conference in Nashville. It was our first in-person event, the Alternative Health Summit, we called it. And we sold probably about 100 tickets. It was an amazing event. Jose was there. And at the end, it's very easy for one part of your brain to be like, oh, we barely made any money, or maybe we didn't even break even on this conference. And then after the fact, there's all these like ripple events that happen as a result of this conference. Like the founder of this huge Austin-based food company comes to us 2 weeks later and is like, hey, I had my breakthrough idea that I think he's raised like $15 million because he had this idea at our conference. And it's like one version of you is just looking purely from the revenue generated from the newsletter or the event, where it's like, if you just like kind of work from that flow state and like just trust what you're doing is the right thing, there are these like unquantifiable opportunities that will happen from that. So interesting.
Yeah. And, even beyond that guy, he owns tons of land in Montana and South Carolina. And because of the fact that he read my book, he shared, I told the property managers not to kill coyotes anymore because that's important to me that we share space with predators. And that's not even something that I personally benefit from.
Yeah.
it's a ripple that is, beyond even myself. It's creating more beauty in the world. It's creating a more beautiful world that I want to exist. And if I'm so myopically focused on the conversion rates and this and that and things, which it's totally understandable. We live in this world, and I understand, and am in a similar situation as you guys, then I lose sight of the more beautiful world that I want to create or be a part of creating.
This has been such an awesome conversation. I feel like we could talk all day just on all the different topics. If there's one spot that, you could send our audience to learn more about what you're doing with sacred hunting, where would that be?
Yeah, I mean, the best place is the website, sacredhunting.com. And, obviously there's plenty of information about people's experiences and what it is and all this kind of stuff. But there's also a bunch of just really neat, projects that we're working on as an organization. We work with combat veterans that have PTSD, and we basically have them come to these experiences and reintegrate, that killer archetype that they're comfortable with. But in a way that's serving themselves, and it allows them to heal. And so, there's a lot of cool stuff that people will appreciate, regardless of whether they decide to join or not.
Well, I know there's a few different ideas that we have in the hopper of potentially working together, which we're super excited about. But to Harry's point, man, it's so cool just to hear your story, hear how deep it is, understand more about these unbelievable experiences and connections you're fostering for a lot of these men out there that need it. And above all else, like, just really humbled to now call you a friend and get to know you better. So appreciate you for coming to the studio, man.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, and thanks for asking great questions. I felt like it was a joy to be here.
Thanks, Mansal. Appreciate it, man.
Thank y'all.